So yeah, I'd like to introduce you all to this masterclass session on digital audience insights. This is going to be covering kind of a range of areas involved in digital audience insight, but this being an emotion focused event, we're also going to be just introducing some examples involving emotion as well. So my name is Abbas. I'm the founder of EntSight, which is a audience intelligence consultancy. My work and my team's work is largely involved with helping large organizations, but also businesses as well, to really understand more about the audiences that they're working with and be able to derive some insight and direction to help inform strategies as well. And I've been fortunate enough to have some of my comment included in publications from like Forrester, The Drum, Times, Wired recently, and Fashion United. Some of the methods I'll be presenting here today have been used by the organisations that I've listed as clients as well. Some partly, some throughout the whole end-to-end process, really, obviously from project to project. Different requirements require different actions. But what is included here today is a good broad understanding of the tools and practices that can be used to better understand digital audience insight. I'm going to be stopping at the end of each section just to answer any questions you may have. Feel free to put anything relevant in the chat box. Don't be shy. I mean, honestly, I'm not going to deride you for asking anything, really, as long as it's reasonable. There's no dumb questions, and I'll try not to give any dumb answers to any questions that you have, really. But please feel free to ask away. And, you know, if it's a new area to you or your experience, it doesn't really matter. Just ask away. Okay, so first of all, best to really set some ground rules and get a sense of, you know, what do I mean when I'm talking about digital audience insight? Because there's a lot of different data out there. There might be varying perceptions about what that actually means. I'm going to be covering here really the work that we do and what we see as kind of core resources when it comes to understanding digital audiences. When we're talking about digital audience insight, it's really referring to the segmentation and analysis of digital audience in order to understand their preferences and behaviours. And this is really best then applied to guide strategies, either for short or long-term projects. So it can be anything from, for instance, developing kind of online customer experience. I know it's just an area that many people here are likely involved in. So using audience insight to understand how audiences interact with digital properties and offline properties. It can be used, especially some more qualitative social media insights can be used very effectively to inform content strategy, but also CRM and email marketing, digital social ad targeting. So obviously the more kind of granular and focused often you can be with your digital ad targeting, the more success you're going to see, and often the more reduced spend you're going to have. So it's very useful there. Customer service and response, e-commerce, even recruitment, and you know, I've even used this kind of work for experiential events. So honestly, pretty much every facet within marketing, customer experience, the strategic development in most areas can be spoken to. Really anything that involves human beings and understanding what their perceptions and behaviours are is where audience insight can be of use. Okay. So really, whilst there are many methodologies that can be used and almost a confusingly labyrinthine amount of tools available, we've tended to focus really on a fairly basic methodology on the surface that's just been most effective really, especially across end-to-end projects, but can be used really within any stage of a project where you're working with audience data. So it's a simple case really of the who in terms of who exactly we're analysing, the what in terms of what their key behaviours are, the why in terms of, well, really qualitatively, why are they behaving in that way, and the how in terms of, well, you know, what do we do with insight? How do we make it actionable? And really, we sort of call each of these sections relative to that: audience segmentation for why, audience analysis for what, conversation analysis for why, sorry, and also strategic insights for how. So fairly basic, but often the foundation of good strategy is actually to keep things more simplistic, to allow for complexity to be easily understood later on. So, you know, I find that's a good approach. There are other ways of doing this. There's a whole range of tools, and I'm going to be focusing really on the ones that we've most experienced with here, that we believe to be best in class. Also, to make sure this is related to the real world and not fictional, we're going to be drawing from a case study, piece of work that we've done with the menswear, UK menswear brand Dress Code, which is available on the EntSight website if you want to see more depth into that. One of the useful things about the dress code work that we do is that it's one of the projects that we do that isn't under NDA. So we can actually expose a lot of the mechanics of what's been involved because contractually we're allowed to. A lot of the work we do for larger brands, we don't have the opportunity to do that, unfortunately. So it's really good to be able to have a case study, and an interesting case study that very much makes use of audience insights that really speaks to a good brand. So let's first of all kind of dive into that section. In fact, before we do that, I'm just going to see if you've got any early questions coming in. Nope, pretty good so far. Okay, that's good. So as I said, I will be answering questions at the end of each section. So if you have anything you want to know, please just fire away. So first of all, we're going to look at the who in terms of audience segmentation. Now, something to understand before we get into this in more depth is that digital audience insight actually differs quite considerably from traditional research in a way that's actually not often talked about. And this is something that someone who's come from a digital background, but previously to that had worked in traditional research. I often find this quite strange that this doesn't get addressed, but it's a hugely important understanding when it comes to actually really determining the difference between traditional research using traditional research data and more nascent and really current sort of forms of research data. Really, it's to do with granularity. It's the fact that ultimately, when you're drawing data from especially social platforms, you're accessing a huge amount of data points that you wouldn't have really had 20 years ago. And that does actually affect, in some ways, the way that you approach that data. And it also opens up a lot of other options in terms of what can be achieved. You can draw down so much more information about the behaviors of audiences. So it's, you know, it's worthwhile understanding that first before we dive in. And if, you know, especially if this is not an area that you're that familiar with, it's good to understand. And it could be that it's an area you're very familiar with, but it hadn't occurred to you. Maybe you agree with me. I don't know. Okay, so I'm going backwards. Yeah, I'm getting some feedback here. Hello? Seth, could you mute, please? Okay. So one of the options when you're actually introducing this concept and kind of differentiation between digital audience insight and traditional audience insight is that, you know, I found that when I'm introducing to clients, it gives a really good opportunity to actually draw out much more depth in terms of how they perceive their audiences. So, for instance, whereas in the past you may have had more limited understanding of what an audience makeup may be, you know, you may have been limited just to kind of core demographics or location, age, gender. You can go so much deeper now, and it's actually a very good opportunity. I found when you're introducing that differentiation and, you know, the possibilities of digital audience insight, to use that as a platform to really dig into how your clients or project stakeholders actually perceive audiences. So, for instance, obviously core demographics, wealth groups, employment, hobbies and interests, and for social media data analysis, the kind of organizations and brands that they might follow on social media. These are all very, very useful indicators. So really the first step when it comes to kind of building the who is, once you've isolated those audiences and you understand who those audiences are, to start to build them on your defined platforms. Within EntSight, we favour audience for social, global web index for survey data for reasons I can come on to in a little while, but also in some instances we might use data from we might use other platforms as well. There's always the option, for instance, to look at own data and sort of segmenting platforms on platforms such as HubSpot and Google Analytics as well. But there's a lot of options available here. I think most of these platforms share a lot of key features. Some are better than others in different areas, admittedly. But generally speaking, if your platform that you're using on any of these categories isn't featured on the list, chances are it can do most of what we're going to be referring to here anyway. So don't worry. So for the purposes of this masterclass, or certainly the first 3 stages of it, I'm going to actually just be using just one audience group from our dress code case study. And that's what we defined in the project as the young male tech professional. And this really, as I was referring to earlier, this came about from us working with Andy, who's the founder of Dress Code, to understand his perception of that audience and doing a little bit of testing to understand that, there was some alignment with the people that were actually out there as well. So, in that instance, we would have then built those audiences on Global Web Index, so using sample data from a year or 2 years, and using quite a large amount of available data points, and also using audience. One is obviously a survey platform. The other one is a social data segmentation platform. So there's different qualities that are focused on, but generally speaking, you can get a fairly accurate mapping of an audience onto both platforms. And the reason why I'll come to a little later on. If you're feeling particularly brave, or if there's budget and a real need within the project to do it, some platforms will then allow you, as we have with audience here, to take an audience and then actually break that down into sub-audiences for analysis as well. So our young tech professional audience for dress code, we were actually able to drill down further and understand that there's a sub-audience of game designers and programmers, the UX experts, and even movie fans, people who talk very actively about JavaScript, believe it or not. So, that's an option, that degree of granularity. It can make things more complex, but also it can really give a deeper understanding of just the kind of the differentiations within the audience. And, you being able to contrast some of those subgroups can be really a route to some interesting learnings as well, but it can be time consuming. Okay, I'm going to stop just at this stage to check for any questions and give you a bit of time to fire any if you have any. Okay. Okay. All good so far. Let's move on then to the what, if we like. So using tools to understand audience analysis, so to understand key behaviors. As a general rule, it's not applicable for all projects, but it's certainly been something that we've found to be very relevant, is that quantitative analysis is the better approach when it comes to understanding audience behaviors. Whereas qualitative analysis is better left to, for instance, looking at their social media conversations. Really, that's better for kind of drawing out an understanding of preference and motivations. So we've made that distinction really here, and it's going to be the first quantitative analysis aspect I'm going to focus on first. So using Global Web Index, this is a example of where we've drilled down into the customer journey for a young tech professional. And as you can see, we're actually addressing different stages here of the customer journey. So we know, for instance, that search and online ads specifically drive discovery when it comes to brands. We also know that, that the research and consideration, search and social networks, consumer reviews and video sites have an active role to play. And we know that when it comes to purchase, that they see a much higher than average use of PayPal, for instance. We've also sort of added in some additional insights that haven't come directly from customer journey here, but really we've drawn out of data points available on GWI relating to this audience's lifestyle and purchase behaviours. So for instance, we know that the young male tech professional is very, very interested in product sensitive, which is something dress code speaks to, which we'll address later on. And they're also very interested in finding out whether or not a particular product they might want to purchase, fashion especially, is going to improve their image or reputation. So we've kind of included that within our customer journey mapping, because even though it doesn't speak directly to how they might buy, it's going to be considerations within their mindset. And when it comes to purchase, for instance, next day delivery, can they buy without registering an account, which I believe is to do with some concerns about data security that the audience has as well. So there's enrichment available there, really across the data points. And again, especially when it comes to survey platforms, there can be a huge amount of available data. So being able to match the relevant data points across different activities is really, really powerful. However, we've found as well that indexing is a tool that can really expose some of the better and more powerful insights within survey data. And actually GWI, because you're able to actually index across, your own customized audiences, no matter how kind of, small or sort of, reduced they are, you can really use it to draw out some interesting insights about an audience. So we can see, for instance, that here looking at the young tech professionals, that, we know that they stick to brands that they like. That's a fairly common behavior in a lot of consumer audiences. Price is more important to them than brand name. These are really useful. However, if we look down at the index points, the two categories at the bottom, we're actually seeing two where they've over-indexed fairly significantly, enough for it to be worth observing further and studying further, in terms of they try to buy premium products. So they're interested in looking at the premium version of a product, which is not necessarily a perception of young male tech professionals buying fashion goods that actually the fashion industry believes in. They tend to believe that they're just wearing t-shirts the whole time, but there is definitely an over-indexing there. And also that they buy brands they see advertised as well, which again was a little bit much of a discrepancy from some of our client perceptions, who believe that actually they might be a little rejecting of advertising. So some interesting learnings there. Okay, I shall stop again at this point to answer any questions, should there be any. Okay, moving on to the next section. Okay, so we've covered so far the segmentation of audiences, and then also the analysis of really behaviours using survey data. Once those behaviours are understood in a quantitative sense, there's going to be a natural curiosity for any good researcher or analyst to understand what behaviours are actually driving, what preferences, motivations, passions are actually driving those behaviours. If I'm honest, quantitative data is not great for that, because there's a whole range of potential answers. And actually, in some cases, only the most sort of self-reflecting and self-aware respondents are going to be able to give any comment on that at all. You know, often we have behaviours that we don't really understand, and we're not necessarily going to answer honestly in terms of what motivates us. This is where social media data, or social media conversation data, should I say, which is coming from very much an unprompted source, is coming from conversation which is just happening online and on social media. This is where these tools are really, really powerful. But equally, approaching the why without defining the what quantitatively first, which is what I've seen a few organisations do in the first, and almost first to social insights to try and determine answers for every possible behavioural question. That doesn't make any sense. You really do need to have an understanding of what people are doing first before you can start to answer the why. And actually, social media isn't particularly good for the what, because it's just, you know, there's such a complex, noisy mass of information there that it can be difficult to derive that. And often people don't actively say, this is my behavior, this is how I buy a holiday. They'll answer questions about it though. So it's good to make a differentiation between, with kind of survey data and quantitative analysis, and social data and qualitative analysis, really which is useful for which, as a rule of thumb. So social conversation data can be used as a very powerful tool for understanding motivations and sentiments, emotions of digital audiences. But as some of you may know already, and if you don't, and it's something that you're curious in to be more involved with, be aware that it is incredibly noisy and unstructured, because it is just conversation. It doesn't follow the same rules as geodata or survey data or financial data. I mean, I've done work with hedge funds in the past who've expected social data to almost cooperate in the way that other data sources do, but that's not really understanding that the source comes from human conversation, which is very complex, very crazy at times. And therefore, you know, the results kind of without that context seem quite random. It is, however, hugely valuable and useful, but you need to apply really some good frameworks to make sure that you're really just filtering out the noise. And I also think that this is a good opportunity to say that, you know, as we've seen from Cambridge Analytica, and we've seen from you know, many kind of questionable behaviours around the use of social media data, there is certainly an ethical line that needs to be dealt with here, and considered. So, you know, much of this data, especially Twitter, Reddit data, is available via platforms, but you have to understand that some of the audiences who are being tracked, as it were, may not necessarily on an individual level understand that. So for instance, you know, I'm personally not a big fan of using people's kind of even usernames or photos to evidence a point on social media, because I don't feel that we have the permission to do that. You may feel differently, I don't know, but it is a tricky area. I know that some organisations certainly are still trying to figure out what they feel is the line there, but it is hugely powerful. Okay, now one very, very smart way to filter out, bearing in mind that your starting point when you're running social media conversation analysis is all available conversation data, which is, you know, billions and billions of posts across multiple platforms. A really good way to start is actually to work from an audience perspective and say, well, okay, I only really want to understand what this particular audience group is saying. So one way you can do this, and this is where, for instance, using a platform like Audience or Affinio, but also Brandwatch Audiences, is really, really useful, is being able to build really a query that can then track conversation just specifically from that audience. Also worth mentioning at this point, just a couple of days ago, I think Brandwatch released a sort of a social survey tool as well, social panel tool, which will make this a lot easier. It's really useful. And also today, Forrester have released a report on social media segmentation, which I'm fortunate enough to be included in, which helps define some best practice in this area as well. This is still relatively unused. I think a lot of organizations still really just tend to track handles and maybe sort of broader topics, but can sort of combining topic analysis with a very specific audience is the most powerful way to get to the insights that you need and understand, you know, those motivations from audiences. To give an example then, we're just going to lift something directly from the quantitative aspect of the work, from the what, and look at, for the young tech professionals, their motivation, their behavior for trying to buy premium versions of a product. So we know that they over-index on this area. They also, 43% of them, which is fair, as an audience percentage, also have this behavior too. So we're going to zero in on that one because it's an interesting and useful understanding, especially for a fashion brand. But we don't really know what's driving it. We don't really understand the conversation that's behind that. We don't really understand what's feeding it, and therefore, without understanding that, you know, the why, it's going to be difficult to really develop any kind of strategic response, or anything but a limited strategic response. Forgive the Boolean here. You may be a wizard at it. You may have never really seen it before, but the way that this this kind of analysis is done, the way this sort of drill down improvisation is done, is using either a wizard within a tool, which is good and will help guide you, but can be a little limiting, or to write your own Boolean code, which actually will then search for specific keywords or combinations of keywords within the social data. It's definitely worthwhile taking the time to really patiently test and retest Boolean if you can. I mean, honestly, you know, one of the biggest problems that social analysts that I know see is that often their clients don't seem to understand that the setup process of social listening is absolutely critical to results. If you go too small and too focused, you're going to miss results. If you go too broad, you're going to have far too much data to understand. So really worth exploring, testing, revising until you get something which is able to really sort of to pull out the data from that big noisy mass of conversation as well. So as you can see from the line of Boolean there, you've got a combination of, you know, terms such as I, so that's identifying people talking about themselves, saying that they buy. The asterisk is essentially to help cover buy or buys or purchasing. And then we're having that near mentions of premium or high quality. I think actually in a more active situation, you'd want to use other referencing keywords, and you'd want to get an understanding of the kind of language that this audience actually uses to describe premium as well, because there may be other terms that are kind of less generic and more colloquial. So it always pays to dig into that. And then brand or product. But equally, if you're working, you know, as we've done with dress code and working with a menswear brand, we probably want to be a little bit more specific about the actual items that they're, you know, looking to buy. So shirt, jacket, trousers, for instance, you know, those are probably terminologies that your average consumers are going to use more than saying, oh, I bought a brand today, or I bought a product today. You know, those are terms used within the marketing industry and within industry, but actually most, you know, consumers are going to say shirt or jacket or trousers or shoes or trainers or sneakers or whatever. So very good use of again, appropriate language for products is going to see well here. I promised some emotional analysis, and here it is. So this, using tech professional audience, we've sort of drilled down into conversation to understand really when they're talking about their premium purchases, what's motivated it, and this is where some really rich behavioural insight can come out. So using Brandwatch's sort of default emotional analysis, which is getting more powerful and more accurate. We know that on social media, the audience expresses joy at premium purchases, and actually this takes the form of a lot of brand recommendations and advocacy. The kind of thing that is really gold for some brands, being able to get their consumers to promote them for free, as it were, on social media. This is, you know, certainly more modern brands more recent brands have used this technique to build. And it's really what influencer marketing is trying to do in a less organic way. Equally, sadness and regret at purchasing lower quality goods rather than premium purchases was something else that we drew out. The largest emotion was actually anger expressed at low quality fast fashion menswear. So this audience was quite a large portion of them, when they were talking about buying more expensive goods, were using that as an opportunity to bash less expensive goods as well. And they were focusing really on the differentiation between, you know, a more poorly made good and cheaper goods in terms of really the durability and longevity as well. So what we have there is some understanding in terms of, you know, what the motivations and feelings are around why they're buying premium products. We're drilling down into that conversation and you know, getting some more detailed insight. But you can also cross-categorize as well. So for instance, this is again in Brandwatch, what we've done here is actually looked at how different emotional conversation relating to premium purchases, and it's getting a little more complex now. We've broken that down in terms of conversations relating to specific brands. So within, you know, our version of EntSight's version of Brandwatch, we actually have a huge taxonomy of brands mapped out that we've been building and populating for about 5 years. So it's, you know, it's relatively easy for us to just run a report whereby we're pulling out this data. And if we look at the conversation, then we know, for instance, that H&M, when they were referred to in terms of buying premium brands, we know that, you know, there was a prominence of both joy and anger, really mixed emotions with regards, because they have made some efforts around sustainability, I believe, in the US to you know, talk to their role within fast fashion, but equally, you know, there's still quite a lot of disparaging conversation around them as well. But equally, you know, we're seeing a lot of joy as well. So they're well loved in terms of their purchases. Nordstrom, which side, you know, does tend to be a bit of a stronger purveyor of luxury goods, saw a more joyful conversation, and we see actually Uniqlo saw more angry conversation, which I'm happy to hear because I'm a big Uniqlo fan myself. But yeah, this is behind all of this kind of these graphs as well. We're able to drill down and look at the specific conversation as well. But you know, given the volume and complexity and noise of the data, being able to cross-categorize and really kind of just slice up the data in this way is really, really useful. And finally, you can really just create categorizations for anything that you can do run effective enough keyword analysis on and build, you know, effective enough Boolean strings, just as long as you have the data. You know, if you have maybe 25 tweets about sustainability from an audience, you're not going to do particularly well because you don't really have the range. But if you've got hundreds of thousands of conversations, and you've built a good taxonomy and categorization and Boolean, then you're going to be able to really track into anything. So here we're applying some rules that have been built around sustainability, general sustainability, environmental sustainability, social sustainability, animal rights, vintage, which kind of speaks more to kind of making do and you know, rather than buying new products, kind of buying old ones to impact the kind of impact on the environment. Reduce the impact on the environment. So we've seen, actually, looking at this young male tech audience, there's a visible shift in the types of conversations around sustainability and environment that they've been having over the past 5 months. So COVID-19 has actually shifted the perspective really actually away from sort of social sustainability and sort of general sustainability, environmental sustainability. It's actually, we're seeing a bit more of a shift towards animal rights in this particular era, so this particular month. So, you know, it's interesting to see that kind of change as well. And I will stop briefly for questions. And there are no questions. Okay. Right, so finally, I'm just going to come on to the house section now, which is, you know, very much dependent on the individual project, really. I mean, how the insights that you've identified are actually applied can really vary depending from the needs of the project. It could be that, you know, the more qualitative analysis is actually more useful. It could be the more qualitative analysis is actually more useful. But as a rule of thumb, whilst it might be, you know, interesting and in some ways useful for the researcher to explore areas they're more keen on, those that tend to stick to the, you know, the real objective and needs of the client, and find a way to kind of speak to how they can, you know, use audience understanding to you know, resolve any problems or meet any objectives. Those are the ones that are going to be better received always at the end of the day. And I think the more pointed, directional, actionable, and focused the insights are, the better response they see from clients, always. For this, I'm actually going to use some examples from the dress code case study because we can talk about them, and also because there's some good actionable examples. This comes mostly from Line survey data, and you'll actually recognise one of the audiences here because it's our young tech professional. It's one of the 4 audiences that we were analysing. So really, there's a few areas that dress code as a new startup fashion brand wanted to understand around how they could innovate, how they should respond to sustainability, and also, you know, how they can drive advocacy. We're talking earlier about advocacy and recommendation in social conversation. You know, how can they push that kind of thing? So we, amongst quite a few other things, draw out some actionable insights to help them respond to those needs and actually learn to and develop strategies to respond to those needs. So first of all, we identified that, you know, there's a real impact of including gifts and discounts when it comes to brand advocacy. Everyone, of course, likes a discount, but one of the areas that was most interesting is that we were seeing, especially among the female tech professionals, that there was a real response to kind of free gifts being included with purchases when it came to advocating their favourite brands. So what dress code put in place to respond to this initially was actually to offer free pocket squares with their shirts. So when they were selling their shirts, they'd include a free pocket square, which, you know, looks quite sartorial and cool in a jacket pocket. That's actually been adapted more recently to face masks. So the team at dress code have now adapted the same material that they were using for pocket squares and have adapted them into face masks. Which is, you know, certainly a case of them moving with the times, and is something I'm sure is going to see a strong response as everybody is going to be buying face masks. We identified that sustainability was an interest in shopping sustainably was really a driving factor for 3 of the audiences. Good opportunity here to talk about, actually, there's a very common perception that because younger audiences will inherit the earth, and, you know, and because, you know, some like Greta Thunberg are active and there's protesting, there's an assumption that actually the biggest concerns around an action and learnings around sustainability comes from younger audiences. That's not true. In most of the audiences we've analysed, it's actually older audiences with a better grasp of the facts. And when it comes to shopping sustainably, those that can actually afford to shop sustainably, because sustainable shopping is more expensive, those are the ones that are more proactive in that space. So it's, you know, if you're working on a sustainable project, do not assume that younger audiences are automatically more interested in sustainability and environment. That's not the case. However, we have seen some data from some of the global web indexes COVID-19 data recently that there's a bit of a shift. Apparently, it's yet to be completely understood, but it seems that there may be, as a result of COVID-19, and certainly as a result of Black Lives Matter, a bit of a shift within younger audiences. But we're only seeing indications. It's not 100%. In order to respond to this, though, Andy and the dress code team were actually ended up developing not just kind of measures to make sure that their goods are more sustainable and long lasting. They also focused a lot on creating social media content for it as well. So, it's one thing to actively engage in sustainable practice, but there's always a good story to tell for brands when it comes to those practices as well. And Andy, and as you can see, his amazing yellow washing machine have been very active in sort of educating their audience on social media and online in terms of how they're implementing sustainable practices. And finally, product innovation, which, given that the audience that dress codes are focused on do tend to be much more technically orientated. I mean, they're IT professionals, software programmers, game designers, going right up to kind of corporate IT and software people. Innovation is always something that the brand are interested in. But innovation is a very broad terminology, and in fashion it could refer to a whole range of things. What we found from studying the audiences was that there was probably not too unexpected, but there was a real drive towards adoption of smartwatches. I mean, there's certainly one of the audiences that you'd expect to be more adoptive there, but also use of NFC, hugely over-indexing in some cases. So we knew that there's already existing behaviour in use of NFC for cash payments using mobile phones and watches. And this inspired Andy to actually think about, well, okay, how do we respond to that? And what he's developed, which is fascinating really, is the means to make a payment rather than using your card or your mobile phone, but actually the cuff of your shirt, using an NFC chip that's embedded, and also a mobile phone application to manage fund transactions as well. So this is called Cash Cuff. It's a really interesting product, and again, one that's been really informed by audience insight and understanding audience behaviours and motivations. Okay, well, with that example, I'm going to bid you adieu and say thank you very much for your time as well.